What can you say about Michael Gove? What can I get away with saying? That would be the question. I can say that he is as brilliant as he is controversial. That means he is actually very brilliant. He's probably, he's probably one of the most brilliant people that have served on the front bench in Parliament in a long time. And also, not without saying that I did qualify it with quite controversial too. But genuinely, he is an incredibly decent man who makes life easy for the journalist, both in his controversy and his brilliance. And he's a personable and delightful person. And therefore, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Michael Gove.
There are currently thousands of men and women in prison on remand, nearly 10,000. And by definition, they are innocent at the time of their incarceration. Placing these men and women in an explicitly criminal environment, ordering their day and framing their surroundings in this way, in a way which is often indistinguishable from the experience of very serious criminals, is often neither conducive to their welfare nor to our safety. Of course, there will always be some allegations so serious, some individuals either potentially so dangerous or at such risk of absconding or offending again, that custody is appropriate before guilt is proven and sentence passed. But is there not a case for ensuring that prisoners on remand are kept in circumstances appropriate to their status? Should we not keep them out of the mixed local prisons in which so many are housed, where they're currently jailed alongside those serving serious life sentences? And should that not be part of a broader strategy of making sure that individual offenders are in prisons that are equipped to change their behaviour, rather than reinforcing many of the factors that have driven criminality in the past? Remand prisoners are not the only members of the prison population housed in institutions which just aren't appropriate for their circumstances. The whole of our prison estate needs to be, and thankfully is being, fundamentally reconfigured. Because the problem in a nutshell is that we have a system operating at practically full capacity, with nowhere near enough flexibility to devote the time, care and attention needed to secure successful rehabilitation. The leadership team at NOMS, the National Offender Management Service, needs to ensure that prisoners are properly assessed on entry to the prison estate, moved on through the system as their sentence is served, and also, if necessary, moved as debts and threats, changing circumstances, and new challenges emerge. But in an estate which has scarcely any headroom or slack in the system, that has led to centralised control in order simply to ensure that every prisoner is, at the very least, housed in accordance with their security level. Ideally, I think that we should have prisons which cater for remand prisoners, some high-security establishments for those who pose the very greatest threat, with facilities within the high-security estate for extremists. I also think that we should have specialist prisons for dealing with sex offenders, and above all, community prisons with strong external links to education and employment providers who can prepare prisoners for effective re-entry into society. But to develop an estate like that, to make our prisons effective at rehabilitation, will require some clear thinking and resolute action on questions as varied as the treatment of young offenders, the place of women prisoners, the implementation of new technology, and critically, sentencing reform. But before touching on those areas, I also think it's important that we step back and reflect on the individuals who make up our prison population at the moment. Now, the first thing to say is they're all individuals. There are peers and priests who've been prisoners, consummate charmers, and men who even their mothers would be hard-pushed to love, dedicated career criminals, and then people who've made just one horrendous mistake. But even though you find all sorts of conditions of men and women in prison, there are some groups which have historically been overrepresented, given their numbers in our society. Now, the most notable overrepresented group is, of course, members of Parliament. From Horatio Bottomley to the present day, the road from Westminster to Wormwood Scrubs is a well-travelled one. But while that group's unlikely to get much public sympathy, we should certainly be much more sensitive to the way in which so many of those who come into contact with our criminal justice system are individuals from disadvantaged groups. I was pleased that we were able to set up a review under David Lammy to investigate the treatment of citizens from black and minority ethnic groups by the criminal justice system. And we already know that a disproportionate number of our fellow citizens who do end up in prison have been abused and neglected as children. In many cases, they will have witnessed or suffered domestic violence when growing up. In many cases, they will have been failed by the education system. And also, in many cases, they will have been brought up in foster or residential care. They will often have been brought up by adults with addiction or other mental health problems, and they will, in all too many cases themselves, suffer from substance abuse and mental illness. They will have been harmed not just physically and psychologically, they will also have endured spiritual and moral deprivation. Many of those in our jails never had someone, when they were young, who loved them enough to tell them the difference between right and wrong. They will have grown up in homes where affection was absent or fleeting, authority arbitrary or brutal. They will never have developed the habits of consideration towards others, deferred gratification, and empathy, which are the cement of civilization. Now, of course, the overwhelming majority of people who face challenging childhoods make successes of their lives. But their achievements deserve all the more recognition because of the difficulties that they've overcome. And those of us who've been fortunate enough to enjoy love, stability, and carefully policed boundaries when we've been growing up should make an extra effort to understand the lives of others who've lived with coldness, violence, and chaos. Then we might appreciate why children who've learned that showing weakness only invites abuse cover up the fact they can't read in class by showing bravado and exhibiting disruptive behavior. These same children who find learning difficult and school alienating are the ones who increasingly, during their education, play truant or invite expulsion. And then they find a deceptive warmth in the intimacy of gang culture. There's a fragile respect they get from outdoing their peers in violence or daring. There's an adrenaline-charged thrill they get from breaking the law. Being thought of as a player by others who are living the life provides a spurious sense of achievement for those unfortunate people who've never been valued so far in their lives in any other way. So many of those in our prisons are damaged individuals, victims themselves, and we should all be careful about the moral judgments that we make about them. Of course, when individuals cross the line and break the law, there has to be punishment. The civic order depends on our policing the boundaries between right and wrong. But it's critical to appreciate that many of those who are in our prisons grew up without the social capital or moral reinforcement the rest of us have been fortunate enough to enjoy. Their ability to resist temptation and to avoid acting impulsively will have been impaired by their upbringing and eroded by their circumstances. Now, as I say, that doesn't mean when they offend that we should suspend the operation of the law. Law-breaking does require the imposition of sanctions. But the deprivation of liberty inherent in being sent to prison is punishment enough. Offenders should not face further degradation or indignity when in custody. Quite the opposite. We should use that time to repair lives, not further blight them. And we need to ensure that prisons build up the resources of character and resilience, which will mean that prisoners are less likely to offend in future. And I believe, with Frank Longford, that such a mission is vital because every single human soul is precious and all of us can achieve something worthwhile if the circumstances are right. But even if you're a hard-bitten cynic who regards all this language as hopelessly naive nonsense, and if you believe that the purpose of the justice system is not to help bad people, but just to protect good people, then you should still want to ensure our prisons are more effective at rehabilitation. Because at the moment, half of those sent to prison offend again within a year of their release. We spend hundreds of thousands keeping these individuals detained under state control. We govern who they see and what they do, what they learn and how they work, who leads and who follows in our prisons. Every minute of their life, for months or perhaps years at a time, is controlled by us. And then, after all that, they go on to offend again and again. Now, that really is criminal. So, given the population that we have, given the urgent need for reform, how do we ensure that our prisons are places of redemption and rehabilitation? Well, the first step, as the Justice Secretary has rightly pointed out, is to restore order to establishments which have become too violent recently. And the additional investment that the Justice Secretary has secured is hugely welcome. And in particular, the recruitment of more prison officers is absolutely necessary at this time. But security can't be an end in itself. And good order in a prison rests not just on extra manpower, effective surveillance, and swift responses to provocation. Good order also springs from ensuring that prisoners are out of their cell as much as possible, instead of being banged up for 23 hours at a time. It depends on ensuring that activities on which prisoners engaged are purposeful and rewarding, instead of poorly directed and repetitive. And security also depends on seeing good behavior and a desire to progress noticed and rewarded, and also ensuring that grievances and complaints are promptly and fairly addressed. Because violence in prison is often related to drugs, either the psychotic effects of substances taken with the intention of dealing with boredom and frustration, i.e. killing bird, or violence as the consequences of drug-related debts going unpaid. It can also be the consequence of frustration at indignities endured, injustices, real or perceived, which go unrecognized, sentence plans chaotically unfulfilled, and privileges arbitrarily withdrawn. Public sector reform can't succeed without effective measurement, usable data, and a commitment to learn from the evidence. And this material will ensure that, if necessary, we can change course as a result of what the data shows us about what's working and what's not working. It is criminal that so much penal policy in the past, here and elsewhere, has not been driven by data and evidence as rigorously as it should have been. But it's also important to recognise that data and measurement needs to be sensitive. In assessing how well prisons are performing, I think we should consider 3 different types of measure. Yes, there should be criteria set by central government that reflect day-to-day performance, but we also need criteria agreed between the centre and individual governors on what long-term success in rehabilitation looks like, and we also need criteria set by governors themselves about the ambitions that they have for their institution and its inmates. And the reason I want to empower governors more is I believe that we have to move away from the centralisation of the past if we're going to get prisons operating successfully as institutions which reintegrate people back into society. Prisoners should no longer be out of sight and out of mind. We should build on the academy model in schools, which has had such a radically beneficial effect. We should seek to involve charities, social enterprises, and wider society in the management and operation of our prison estate. We should develop management teams for prisons which involve outside educators and employers, local government figures, and those with wider professional expertise. The success of our prisons should be a shared social priority for all of us, not just a matter for NOMS and the MOJ, and we should all, as a society, take responsibility for what happens to offenders. Now, academies have also benefited from business links, both in helping them to operate more effectively day to day and in opening up links to the wider world of work. Foundation trusts in the NHS have also benefited not just from public-spirited professionals from diverse backgrounds contributing to improving their governance, but they've also benefited from improved relationships with partners outside the NHS. Well, we should want prisons to benefit in the same way. We should want prisons to have principals who run local colleges, or business people who hire apprentices, or employers who recruit new colleagues, or social work leaders involved in the supervision of those in care, all involved, working together in setting goals for prisons and providing opportunities for prisoners. It's already the case that the first reform prisons are exploring how to establish such links and relationships. But I would argue that over time, all prisons, apart from perhaps a few high-security establishments, should go down this community path. And I would certainly like to see the educational achievement and the employment success of prisoners become as much a matter of local concern or pride as school GCSE results or joblessness figures overall in the community. We should be insistent that the pressure for change and improvement never slackens. Far too many of the educational courses offered to prisoners are still unambitious and uninspiring. We discovered as a government in schools that setting higher expectations is a necessary precondition to improvement. Prison education, far more than any other area of the education system, still suffers from the soft bigotry of low expectations. And the situation is, if anything, worse when it comes to prison work. The prison with the highest number of inmates in productive employment, Coldingley, in my constituency of Surrey Heath, still has fewer than half its prisoners doing useful remunerative work that enhances their skill level. I believe that we should now allow governors to form commercial arrangements with employers where the profits made by prisoners' endeavours can be reinvested not just in the prisoners' education and welfare, but also placed in an account for the prisoners to access after a period of jail, out of jail, without repeat offending. Now, as matters stand, prisons are not allowed to operate enterprises that might, even marginally, have an adverse effect on other local businesses. I think these rules, along with a mountain of other bureaucracy, make it difficult for employers to operate effective commercial partnerships with prisons. I would sweep away all of these rules and allow prisons to bid, compete, and sell services in any way that they can to give prisoners the chance to feel fully integrated into the nation's economic life and then earn money that they can go on to enjoy if their rehabilitation has proven successful. And that is also why I think it is right to extend the number of prisoners who can be released on temporary license, freed to work outside the prison estate during the day, because they reintegrate themselves into civil society and they learn to become assets rather than liabilities. The alternative to change is the status quo. A declining criminal bar, a worsening situation in our prisons, a recidivism rate that is indefensible. So, not to change, not to reform our system when we know we can do better, that really would be criminal. Thank you.